We only invited you out of pity. My daughter said it so casually that for a moment I thought I must have heard her wrong. The string quartet kept playing in the background. Crystal glasses clinked softly around us. Somewhere near the giant birthday cake, people were laughing, and my own daughter had just looked me in the eye and told me I was only there because they felt sorry for me. I smiled anyway. At 70 years old, you learn there are humiliations too deep to react to immediately. Some wounds arrive so quietly that your body freezes before your heart catches up. I simply adjusted the sleeve of my pale blue dress and took a sip of champagne with hands that trembled only slightly. 3 days later, my daughter's lawyer would call me in tears. But that night, no one at the party knew that yet. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and tell me where you're watching from. Sometimes I wonder how many mothers out there have sat in crowded rooms and still felt completely alone. The party was held at the Grand Whitmore Hotel in downtown Boston. Rebecca had chosen the venue herself. She'd insisted my 70th birthday deserved something elegant. That was the word she kept using all month. Elegant. The ballroom certainly looked elegant enough. Gold chandeliers glowed overhead, reflecting against polished marble floors. Tall white roses stood in crystal vases on every table. A jazz trio played softly near the dance floor, while waiters carried trays of champagne beneath warm amber lights. To anyone looking in from the outside, it probably seemed like a loving family celebration. That illusion mattered deeply to Rebecca. My daughter had always cared more about appearances than feelings. I stood near the center table while guests mingled around me. Old family friends hugged me politely. Neighbors smiled for photographs. Someone complimented my dress. But Rebecca never stayed beside me for more than a few seconds at a time. She floated through the ballroom like a politician, working a crowd, touching elbows, laughing loudly, making sure everyone noticed how much effort she'd put into her mother's party. My mom deserves the best, she kept telling people. It almost sounded believable. Almost. I noticed the distance long before the cruel comment. Little things. Rebecca had seated me at a side table instead of beside her family. My grandson, Ethan, barely looked up from his phone when I greeted him. Olivia hugged me warmly, but even she seemed tense, as though she was worried the evening might crack apart at any moment. Michael, my son-in-law, avoided eye contact altogether. That told me more than anything else. A guilty man can rarely look directly at the person being betrayed. Still, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. At my age, people become frightened of becoming unwanted. Every forgotten phone call feels heavier. Every canceled holiday invitation echoes longer than it should. So we make excuses for the people we love. I had spent years making excuses for Rebecca. She's stressed. She's busy. She doesn't mean it that way. A mother becomes skilled at translating cruelty into misunderstanding. The birthday cake arrived around 8 o'clock. 3 tiers. White frosting. Gold lettering. Happy 70th Margaret. Everyone gathered around while the musicians switched to "What a Wonderful World." Guests lifted their phones. Rebecca wrapped one manicured arm around my shoulder for the photographs. Her perfume smelled expensive and sharp, like white lilies left too long in the sun. "Smile, Mom," she whispered through clenched teeth. So I smiled. The candles flickered in front of me while everyone sang. For one brief moment, standing beneath the warm lights, hearing all those voices together, I almost felt happy. Almost. Then I overheard Rebecca speaking behind me near the champagne tower. She didn't realize I could hear her. One of her friends had asked quietly, "Does your mom still live alone in that giant house?" Rebecca laughed softly. "Well, for now." The woman looked uncomfortable. It must be nice doing all this for her. Rebecca took a sip of wine before answering. "We only invited her out of pity," she said casually. Honestly, if we didn't, she'd spend another birthday alone, pretending people still care.
The room didn't stop. Nobody gasped dramatically. Nobody spilled a drink.
That's the strange thing about heartbreak. The world keeps moving normally, while your own reality quietly collapses inside your chest. I stood frozen beside my birthday cake while conversations continued around me. A waiter walked past, carrying crab cakes. Someone laughed near the bar. And my daughter kept talking, as though she hadn't just carved something out of me with a knife. She's become so emotional lately, Rebecca continued. You know how elderly people get. Elderly people. Not Mom, not Margaret, just elderly people. I looked down at my hands. They suddenly seemed older than they had that morning. Thin skin, blue veins, fingers trembling slightly beneath the ballroom lights. For the first time in my life, I saw myself the way my daughter apparently saw me. Not as family. Not as the woman who stayed awake, sewing Rebecca's prom dress, because we couldn't afford a new one. Not as the mother who worked double shifts at the library after Richard died, so Rebecca could finish college without debt. Not as the grandmother who sold her wedding bracelet to help pay Ethan's private school tuition. Just an aging inconvenience standing in the middle of an expensive party. Olivia noticed my expression first. "Grandma?" she asked softly, stepping toward me. "Are you okay?" I looked at my granddaughter and saw genuine concern in her eyes. It nearly broke me more than Rebecca's words, because kindness feels unbearable once you realize how long you've been starving for it. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I lied gently. Across the room, Rebecca finally turned and noticed me standing there. For half a second, something flickered across her face. Not guilt. Fear. She realized I had hurt her. But then, just as quickly, her expression smoothed back into that polished social smile she wore so well. "Mom," she called brightly. "We're about to do speeches." As though nothing had happened. As though humiliation could simply be folded beneath expensive decorations and champagne bubbles. I smiled back at her, calmly, quietly, and that was the moment my daughter made the biggest mistake of her life. Because Rebecca thought silence meant weakness. She had no idea silence was what people like me used when we finally stopped protecting the ones who hurt us. I didn't cry on the drive home. That surprised me more than Rebecca's words. For years, I had imagined betrayal would feel loud, dramatic, like shattered a glass or screaming voices in the middle of the night. But the real thing felt quiet, heavy, like slowly sinking underwater while everyone around you kept breathing normally. Boston was unusually cold for early October. Rains misted against my windshield as I drove through downtown streets, glowing with reflections from traffic lights and storefront windows. The bouquet Rebecca had given me at the party rested in the passenger seat beside me. White roses, expensive ones. By the time I reached my house in Lexington, several petals had already started turning brown around the edges. I noticed that immediately. Funny how heartbreak sharpens your attention to dying things. The house was dark when I stepped inside. Completely silent except for the old grandfather clock near the staircase ticking steadily in the hallway. Richard had bought that clock during our 10th anniversary trip to Vermont. "It sounds like a heartbeat," he'd told me back then. Tonight, it sounded lonelier. I hung my coat carefully by the door and stood still for a moment inside the entryway. At 70 years old, coming home to an empty house after humiliation feels different than it does when you're young. When you're young, you still believe loneliness is temporary. At my age, loneliness starts feeling permanent. The heels Rebecca insisted I wear had blistered my feet. I slipped them off slowly and carried them upstairs in one hand. My birthday card slid slightly from my purse as I climbed the staircase. Most of them were signed with the same kind of polite distance. "Wishing you health and happiness. Hope you enjoy your special day." No real warmth, no memories, no love, just obligation. I entered my bedroom and stopped automatically beside Richard's photograph on the dresser. He'd been gone 8 years, but sometimes grief still moved through the house like weather. Quiet, unpredictable, lingering in corners when I least expected it. In the photo, he was smiling beside our sailboat on Cape Cod, one arm around my waist, sunlight caught in his silver hair. I stared at him for a long moment. Then I finally said out loud what I hadn't been willing to admit before. She hates me. The words barely sounded like my own voice. Not loud, not angry, just tired. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked around the room we had shared for nearly 40 years. The floral curtains I'd sewn myself. Richard's old reading chair near the window. The faint lavender scent from the drawer sachets I still replaced every spring out of habit. A whole lifetime sat inside this house. And suddenly, I understood something terrifying. Rebecca didn't see memories when she looked at this place. She saw property value. Earlier that summer, she had started making strange little comments. You know, Mom, houses in Lexington are selling for insane prices right now. Or, this place is probably too much work for one person. At the time, I thought she was worried about me. Now I wondered if she'd been measuring the house room by room in her head. I changed into my nightgown slowly and removed my jewelry at the vanity mirror. My birthday necklace, the one Rebecca gave me that evening, lay cold in my palm. Gold-plated, not real gold. Rebecca would never notice the difference. But I did. Because when you spend most of your life surviving carefully, you learn the weight of real things. I opened in the drawer beside my bed and placed the necklace inside without another thought. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from Rebecca. Had such a wonderful night celebrating you. I stared at the screen for several seconds. No mention of what she'd said. No apology. Just performance. Even now, she was protecting the image of herself more than the reality of what she'd done. Another message appeared immediately after. Also, Michael and I think it's time we discuss some safer living options for you. Maybe somewhere with less maintenance. There it was. Not even 12 hours after my birthday party. I suddenly remembered the way Michael avoided looking at me all evening. The nervous tension in Olivia's face. The whispered conversation near the champagne tower. This had been planned for a long time. My chest tightened. Not from anger. From clarity. There's a dangerous moment in every betrayal. When confusion finally disappears. When all the tiny humiliations of previous years suddenly line up perfectly, like dominoes. Christmas dinners canceled at the last minute. Family vacations I somehow learned about afterward. Rebecca insisting I stop driving at night, even though my eyesight remained perfectly fine. The time she laughed and told her friends. Mom still thinks she can manage everything herself. Not concern. Control. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window overlooking the backyard. The maple trees had already started turning red for autumn. Richard used to rake those leaves into giant piles for Rebecca when she was little. She would jump into them wearing tiny rain boots and squeal loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Back then, she used to run into my arms. Now, she was trying to move me out of my own life. I folded my arms tightly against the chill creeping through the room. Then, for the first time all night, I smiled. Not because I was happy, because something inside me had finally gone still. Rebecca thought age had made me weak, fragile, confused. But she had forgotten something very important. I might have been old, but this house, this family, this entire life they were trying to push me out of. I built it. And people who build things usually know exactly how to protect them. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For 38 years, my mornings had begun the same way. Coffee first, then the kitchen window, above the sink. Richard used to joke that I spent more time looking out that window than actually cooking. You watch the world like it owes you answers, he once told me. Maybe he was right. The October sky outside was still dark blue when I walked downstairs in my robe and slippers. The hardwood floors creaked softly beneath my feet. familiar and comforting in a way people no longer were. I started the coffee maker and stood quietly in the kitchen while it brewed. The silence no longer felt peaceful. Now it felt observant, as though the house itself had finally realized something was wrong. Rebecca's text from the night before still sat unanswered on my phone, maybe somewhere with less maintenance. Such careful wording. That was Rebecca's gift. She knew how to disguise cruelty as concern. Even as a little girl, she had learned how to smile sweetly while getting exactly what she wanted. I carried my coffee into the dining room and froze slightly when I saw the birthday flowers sitting in the center of the table. White roses, beautiful from a distance, dying up close. Several petals had already fallen overnight. I sat down slowly and stared at them while memories surfaced one after another. Not dramatic memories, small ones. The dangerous thing about manipulation is that it rarely begins with one monstrous act. It begins quietly, politely, small enough that you question yourself instead of the other person. 3 years earlier, Rebecca had convinced me to hand over copies of my banking passwords in case of emergencies. 2 years ago, she insisted, I add her to my medical contacts because older people shouldn't manage things alone. Last Christmas, she laughed in front of guests when I forgot the name of an actor during dinner. See, she joked. Mom's getting forgetful. Everyone laughed lightly, including me. But later that night, I cried in the bathroom like a fool because I remembered the actor's name the second. I got home. Humiliation ages a person faster than time ever could. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table. Olivia. Good morning. Did you get home okay last night? I smiled before I could stop myself. That girl had Richard's heart. Yes, sweetheart. I'm fine. The typing bubble appeared immediately. I'm sorry about Mom. My chest tightened. Not because of the words, because someone else had noticed. I stared at the message for a long moment before answering carefully. You have nothing to apologize for. Another pause. Then, she's been acting strange lately. I almost laughed at that. Children always think family problems begin recently. They don't realize dysfunction usually grows slowly, over years like cracks beneath wallpaper. I typed, don't worry about me. Focus on school. But Olivia answered almost instantly. Grandma, is she trying to make you sell the house? There it was. Direct. Honest. Uncomfortable. I looked around the dining room automatically. The built-in oak cabinets Richard installed himself. The china set we bought after Rebecca was born. The tiny scratch near the window where toddler Rebecca once crashed her tricycle indoors during a thunderstorm. Sell the house, as if a life could be reduced to square footage. Before I could respond, another message came through. Dad and Mom were arguing about it after the party. I sat very still. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. One beat after another. Mom says the house is wasted on one person. Wasted. I closed my eyes briefly. That word hurt more than the birthday comment somehow, because I suddenly understood the full picture. Rebecca no longer saw me as a mother. She saw me as an obstacle, standing in the middle of valuable property. My hands wrapped tighter around the coffee mug. At 70, people begin treating your independence like a temporary inconvenience. They stop asking what you want. Instead, they discuss your future as though you're not in the room. Senior communities, safer living options, less maintenance. The language sounds caring until you realize it all points toward the same thing: removal. Another message appeared from Olivia. Please don't tell Mom I texted you. I won't. Then after a pause, I added, thank you for telling me the truth. Her reply came slowly this time. You always tell me the truth, Grandma. I had to set the phone down after that, because suddenly I remembered another moment from years ago. Rebecca at 16. standing in this exact dining room screaming because I wouldn't let her skip school for a weekend trip with friends. "You ruin everything," she shouted. I remembered how devastated she looked afterward when she realized she'd made me cry. Back then, guilt still existed inside her. Now I wasn't so sure. I stood and carried my empty coffee cup into the kitchen. Outside, cold wind scattered red leaves across the backyard patio. Richard built that patio the summer before Rebecca left for college. He spent 3 weekends laying every stone himself. "This house will always be hers too," he'd said proudly. Poor Richard. He believed love automatically created loyalty, but love without boundaries sometimes creates entitlements instead. My phone rang suddenly. Rebecca. I watched her name flash across the screen while something cold settled quietly into my stomach. For years, I would have answered immediately. A mother always answers. This time, I let it ring twice before picking up. "Morning, Mom!" Rebecca's voice sounded bright, effortless. "Just checking on you after last night, as though she hadn't humiliated me in front of an entire ballroom." "I'm fine," I said calmly. "Good." A pause. "So, Michael found this wonderful senior living community in Wellesley. They have private gardens, yoga classes, transportation services." I walked slowly toward the kitchen window while she spoke. The maple trees swayed in the wind. My reflection in the glass looked older than it had a week ago. But my eyes looked clearer, much clearer. "Rebecca," I interrupted softly. "Yes?" For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that changed everything. "Exactly, when did you start planning my life without me?" Rebecca didn't answer my question immediately. On the other end of the phone, I heard the faint clicking of heels against what was probably the hardwood floor of her office. She always paced when she was irritated. "Mom," she said, finally, her tone tightening slightly. "You're being dramatic." Dramatic. That word again. Children start using words like that when they want your feelings to sound unreasonable. I leaned one hand against the kitchen counter and watched rain slide slowly down the window above the sink. "I asked you a simple question," I said quietly. Another pause. Then came the soft sigh. Rebecca used, whenever she was preparing to explain life to me as though I were a difficult child. "We're worried about you," she said. "That house is huge. You're alone all the time. Michael and I are just trying to think ahead." Think ahead. Interesting phrase. Not once during that conversation did she ask what I wanted. Not once did she ask whether I was happy here. The decision had already been made somewhere in her mind. She was simply trying to guide me toward accepting it peacefully. I suddenly remembered something Richard once told me shortly before he died. "People rarely steal all at once, Maggie. They take little pieces until you barely notice what's missing." At the time, he'd been talking about business partners. Now I understood he could have been talking about family too. "I'm not moving," I said calmly. Rebecca laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. "We're not saying tomorrow." "Not yet," I thought. "But eventually you'll need help." There it was again. The slow erosion of independence. Not a direct attack. A steady weakening. Like water wearing down stone. "I have help," I replied. "I have neighbors, friends. A doctor. I manage perfectly fine. For now." The words landed carefully between us. For now. As though my entire life had become temporary. I closed my eyes briefly. When Rebecca was little, she used to climb into my lap whenever thunderstorms frightened her. She'd wrap both arms around my neck and whisper, "Don't let anything happen to me, Mommy." I spent years believing motherhood created permanent love. Nobody tells you children eventually become strangers capable of discussing your future like a financial inconvenience. "Mom?" Rebecca's voice sharpened slightly. "Are you listening?" "Yes. Well, maybe we can at least tour the community this weekend. Olivia can come too. They have beautiful apartments and, no, silence. Not angry silence, stunned silence. Rebecca wasn't used to hearing no from me anymore. After Richard died, I became softer with her. Grief does that to some women. It exhausts your instinct to fight. I started avoiding conflict because every argument reminded me how alone I was. And Rebecca learned that quickly. The less I resisted, the more she controlled. I don't understand why you're being difficult, she said carefully. Difficult. Another useful word people use against aging women. If we stay quiet, we're fragile. If we defend ourselves, we're difficult. I looked around my kitchen slowly while she spoke. The pale yellow walls Richard painted himself. The tiny burn mark near the stove from one disastrous Thanksgiving turkey in 1998. The shelf filled with ceramic birds Rebecca made during elementary school art classes. Every inch of this room carried fingerprints of my life. And suddenly, I understood something clearly enough to frighten me. Rebecca wasn't trying to preserve my dignity. She was trying to manage my exit. I'm tired, I said finally. We'll talk another time. Before she could answer, I ended the call. My hand trembled slightly afterward. Not from fear, from adrenaline. Because setting boundaries after years of silence feels almost violent at first. The house became quiet and tightened again. I stood there listening to the refrigerator hum softly while rain tapped against the windows. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Richard in his hospital bed during his final week alive. The machines beeping softly around him, his hand weak in mine. Maggie, he whispered. That night. Promise me something. I leaned closer because his voice had become so faint by then. Don't let anyone make you feel unnecessary. At the time, I cried and told him not to talk like that. I thought he was afraid of leaving me alone. Now I wondered if he had already seen something changing in Rebecca that I refused to notice. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Michael. Sorry about Rebecca. She means, well. I stared at the message and almost laughed. People always excuse cruelty when it arrives wearing polite clothes. I typed back carefully. Does she? The typing bubble appeared. Disappeared. Returned again. Finally, she's under a lot of financial stress right now. My chest tightened instantly. There it was. Not concern. Money. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table while my heartbeat began to quicken. Rebecca and Michael lived well beyond their means. The expensive cars. Country club memberships. Luxury vacations posted constantly online. I used to assume success paid for all of it. Now I wasn't so sure. Another message arrived. Please don't mention this to her. Followed by, but the house sale would solve a lot of problems for them. Them. Not me. I looked toward the hallway where framed family photographs covered the wall. Rebecca at age 5 holding a pumpkin almost bigger than her body. Rebecca graduating college tucked in a white dress while Richard cried beside me. Rebecca on her wedding day asking me to zip up her gown because nobody does it as gently as you. How does a person go from loving you to calculating your value? I didn't know. But for the first time, I finally understood something else. This wasn't emotional carelessness anymore. It was a plan. And plans leave evidence behind. 2 days passed before I left the house again. Not because I was afraid of Rebecca. Because once you finally see the truth about someone you love, the entire world feels slightly unfamiliar afterward. Like walking through your own life wearing the wrong prescription glasses. Everything looks distorted at first. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold. I drove to St. Andrew's Church for the weekly women's breakfast, gathering I'd attended for nearly 15 years. Normally, I enjoyed those mornings, quiet conversations. Weak coffee. Too many pastries. Nobody should be eating at our age. Routine has a way of keeping lonely people alive. I parked beside Dorothy Hayes' silver Buick, just as church bells rang 9 o'clock. Dorothy noticed me the moment I walked into the fellowship hall. There you are. I was beginning to think your glamorous birthday party made you too important for the rest of us. I smiled politely. Dorothy's expression changed immediately. At 73, she had the sharp instincts of someone who'd survived disappointment, without letting it make her cruel. "What happened?" she asked softly. I almost lied. That's the strange habit mothers develop. We protect our children long after they stop protecting us. But something inside me felt too exhausted to pretend anymore. Dorothy carried 2 cups of coffee toward a quiet corner table near the windows. Rain tapped softly against stained glass panels behind us. "You look pale," she said. "I'm fine. Maggie."
She gave me a look over the rim of her coffee cup.
"You once drove yourself to church with pneumonia because you didn't want to miss choir practice. If you're saying you're fine, then something is definitely wrong." Despite myself, I laughed quietly, and suddenly my eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears, just tired ones. I looked down quickly, embarrassed. "I think Rebecca wants to get rid of me," I whispered. Dorothy didn't react with shock. That frightened me more than if she had. Instead, she stirred cream slowly into her coffee and asked, "How long has this been going on?" The question settled heavily between us. "Not? What do you mean?" "Not. I'm sure you're misunderstanding. How long?" As though she already knew. I stared at her. "You noticed," Dorothy sighed softly. "Maggie, people notice more than you think." My chest tightened instantly. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Last spring at the charity gala, Rebecca spent 20 minutes joking about how you couldn't manage on your own much longer." Everyone laughed politely, but it made people uncomfortable. I felt heat crawl slowly into my face. Humiliation always feels worse when you discover it happened publicly. "There's more," Dorothy continued carefully. "I didn't want to interfere before because she's your daughter. But lately," she hesitated, "she's been talking about your house constantly." My stomach turned cold. Dorothy glanced around before continuing. She asked, "My realtor nephew, how quickly homes in your neighborhood usually sell." I stared at her without speaking. The fellowship hall buzzed quietly around us. Forks scraping plates. Women discussing grandchildren and medications and weather forecasts. Normal life. Meanwhile, my own daughter had apparently been planning my removal like a business transaction. "She told people you were considering assisted living," Dorothy said gently. "I never said that. I know." Something inside me shifted then. Not heartbreak this time. Recognition. Because lies repeated often enough begin creating their own reality. Rebecca wasn't just planning to move me eventually. She was preparing everyone around us to see it as reasonable. Strategic, careful, slow. Exactly the way she handled real estate deals. Dorothy reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Maggie, has she asked about your finances?"
Immediately about the banking passwords.
The constant questions about bills and insurance paperwork." "Yes," I admitted quietly. Dorothy's mouth tightened. "You need to be careful." The words landed harder than she probably intended. Careful, as though my own child had become something dangerous. I looked down at my coffee cup, suddenly unable to swallow. "She's my daughter," I whispered weakly. Dorothy's expression softened immediately. "I know." Then, after a pause, "But sometimes family feels entitled to things strangers would never dare touch." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside, rain drifted sideways across the church parking lot. The maple trees bent under the wind, their red leaves scattering across wet pavement. Finally, Dorothy spoke again. "You remember Evelyn Parker?" I nodded slowly. Everyone in town remembered Evelyn. Sweet woman, widowed, 2 sons. She signed power of attorney paperwork she didn't fully understand 3 years ago, Dorothy said quietly. Her boys sold the house 6 months later. A chill ran through me. She ended up in a tiny apartment outside Worcester. Barely sees either of them now. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup, even though it had already gone cold. That won't happen to me, I said automatically, but my voice lacked conviction. Dorothy noticed. Maggie, she said carefully. Have you actually read everything Rebecca's asked you to sign lately? My mind flashed immediately towards dozens of small moments. Insurance updates, hospital forms, temporary paperwork. Rebecca standing beside me saying, just sign here, Mom. Trusting your children becomes dangerous when they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as an asset. The room suddenly felt too warm, too small. I need some air, I whispered. Dorothy stood immediately. Outside the church entrance, cold wind hit my face sharply. I breathed deeply while rain dampened the sleeves of my coat. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Dorothy said quietly, You should talk to Walter Pierce. I turned toward her. Richard's old attorney, the same man who handled our wills nearly a decade earlier. Why? Dorothy held my gaze steadily. Because good men usually prepare for problems before women like us even realize they exist. I stared out toward the rain-covered parking lot while something heavy settled deep in my chest. For the first time since my birthday party, fear finally gave way to something else. Suspicion. And suspicion, unlike grief, has a way of waking people up very quickly. I called Walter Pierce the following morning. For several minutes before dialing, I simply sat at my kitchen table, staring at his business card beside my untouched toast. The card itself looked older than some marriages. Thick cream paper, dark embossed lettering. Walter Pierce, ESSQ. Richard always trusted men who still used paper business cards. They take permanence seriously, he used to say. At 9:15, I finally picked up the phone. Walter answered himself on the third ring. Pierce speaking. His voice sounded exactly the same. Calm. Precise. The kind of voice that made people straighten paperwork instinctively. Walter? I said softly. It's Margaret Holloway. A brief pause. Then warmth entered his tone immediately. Maggie? Nobody had called me Maggie since Richard died except Dorothy. How are you? He asked gently. I almost said fine. Instead, I surprised myself by telling the truth. I think my daughter is trying to take my house. Silence settled briefly between us. Not shocked silence, measured silence. Walter said quietly, Can you come in this afternoon? That frightened me more than if he had laughed it off. His office sat in an old brick building near Lexington Center, above a bookstore Richard loved. Walking inside felt like stepping backward 20 years. Dark wood shelves, leather chairs, the faint scent of coffee and old paper. Stability. Walter looked older, of course, thinner than I remembered, more silver in his hair. But his eyes remained sharp. After a few minutes of polite conversation, he folded his hands together and looked directly at me. Tell me everything. So I did. The birthday party. Rebecca's comments. The pressures about senior living. The questions about finances. The quiet campaign happening behind my back. Walter listened without interrupting once. Occasionally, he made small s in a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back slowly in his chair. Maggie, he said carefully, when was the last time you reviewed your estate documents? I blinked. After Richard passed away, I think. That was 8 years ago. I suddenly felt foolish. Back then, grief swallowed everything. I signed documents because people told me to sign them. I trusted Rebecca to help organize paperwork, while I could barely think clearly enough to choose flowers for a funeral. Walter opened a thick file cabinet drawer beside his desk. Then he pulled out a dark blue folder with my name written neatly across the tab. Margaret Holloway. Seeing your entire life reduced to one folder is unsettling. Walter adjusted his glasses and opened it carefully. Richard updated several documents 6 months before he died, he said. I frowned slightly. He never mentioned that. He didn't want to worry you. My stomach tightened. Walter removed several papers slowly before continuing. Your husband was concerned about potential financial pressure from family members after his death. I stared at him. Richard knew? Walter met my gaze calmly. He didn't predict specifics, but he was a careful man. Yes. Richard noticed things quietly. That was one of the reasons I loved him. Walter slid one document across the desk toward me. There's a protective clause attached to the property trust. The legal wording blurred slightly at first beneath my eyes. Then one sentence became painfully clear. Any beneficiary found manipulating, coercing, or financially exploiting Margaret Holloway shall immediately forfeit inheritance rights connected to the family estate. I looked up sharply. Walter nodded once. Richard insisted on it. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. I suddenly remembered one conversation years ago after Rebecca pressured us for money during her second failed business investment. Richard stood at the kitchen sink afterward, staring out the window quietly. She's beginning to confuse love with access, he'd said softly. At the time, I accused him of being too harsh. Now guilt settled heavily inside my chest. Walter folded his hands again.
Maggie,
Has Rebecca asked you to sign anything recently? Images flashed immediately through my mind. Insurance forms, bank authorization updates, medical release paperwork. My heartbeat quickened. I don't know, I admitted quietly. Maybe. Walter's expression tightened slightly. Then we need to review everything immediately. Fear crept slowly into my stomach. Not dramatic fear. The cold, practical kind. The kind that arrives when life stops feeling emotionally painful and starts becoming legally dangerous. Walter opened another folder. There's something else. His voice changed slightly when he said it, more cautious. 3 weeks ago, Rebecca contacted my office. The room suddenly felt smaller. She did what? She requested copies of certain trust documents. He paused carefully and asked questions about property transfer procedures connected to incapacity planning. Incapacity. The word hit me like ice water. She thinks I'm losing my mind. Walter chose his next words carefully. She implied she was becoming concerned about your ability to manage independently. I felt physically sick, not because strangers believed it, because my own daughter was building a narrative around me, while smiling at birthday parties and signing texts with little heart emojis. Walter leaned forward slightly. Maggie, listen to me carefully. I looked up. You are not powerless here. The words nearly broke me, because I hadn't realized how powerless Rebecca had slowly made me feel until someone finally said otherwise. So Walter slid a business card across the desk toward me. I want you to gather every recent document you've signed, every bank statement, every insurance change, everything. I nodded slowly. Then he added one final sentence that stayed with me the entire drive home. And from this moment forward, do not sign another piece of paper your daughter gives you. That evening, I pulled every file box out of the hallway closet. Richard used to joke that I organized paperwork like a museum archivist. Every receipt labeled, every insurance statement dated, every tax document filed in neat manila folders. Back then, it felt excessive. Now it felt like survival. The hallway floor disappeared beneath stacks of binders within an hour. Medical records, bank statements, property taxes, retirement documents. I sat cross-legged on the living room rug, wearing my reading glasses, while rain tapped steadily against the windows outside. The house smelled faintly like dust and old paper. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt sharper than my emotions. That surprised me. Pain had spent days making me feel small, fragile. But now something else was happening beneath the grief. Focus. I opened a folder labeled Medical Authorization and immediately spotted Rebecca's handwriting clipped to the front. Just temporary emergency access. Mom. I remembered signing it after my pneumonia scare last winter. At the time, she'd stood beside my hospital bed, holding a smoothie and speaking softly enough to sound caring. You shouldn't worry about paperwork right now. I trusted her completely. Now my stomach tightened as I read the fine print carefully for the first time. Extended financial communication authorization. Why would medical paperwork involve my finances? I reached for another folder, then another. Each document revealed tiny things I should have questioned months ago. Updated banking contacts. Duplicate account notifications sent to Rebecca's email. Authorization discussions regarding long-term care consultation. Long-term care. The phrase appeared repeatedly. Not openly enough to alarm me, just quietly enough to normalize the idea over time. I suddenly understood the brilliance of what Rebecca had been doing. She wasn't trying to force me out all at once. She was building a paper trail, one document at a time, one conversation at a time, creating the image of an aging woman slowly losing independence. A woman who would eventually need someone else making decisions for her. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes slowly. Outside, wind rattled branches against the windows. The house suddenly felt colder. My phone buzzed beside me. Rebecca. I stared at the screen without answering immediately. Then another message appeared. Family dinner Sunday at our house. Everything about Rebecca looked affectionate from a distance. That was what made her dangerous. I typed carefully. I'll think about it. 3 dots appeared instantly as she began replying. Mom, please don't be upset about last week. You know how stressful things have been. Stressful. Interesting how people explain cruelty afterward as stress, exhaustion, pressure, hormones, grief. Anything except character. Another message arrived. We're only trying to help you. I looked around the living room slowly. The navy armchair Richard loved. The Afghan blanket my mother knitted before she died. 40 years of Christmas mornings near the fireplace. Help me? No. Rebecca was trying to prepare for me for removal, while convincing herself it was compassion. The difference matters. I set the phone face down without responding further. Then I noticed something strange buried beneath an old insurance folder. A legal envelope. My name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. My breath caught instantly. I stared at it for several seconds before opening it carefully. Inside sat a single folded letter. Maggie, if you're reading this, then something has probably started happening that I prayed never would. My hands began trembling immediately. Richard's handwriting always leaned slightly to the right when he was emotional. I continued reading slowly. You love people completely. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But complete love sometimes blinds you to selfishness, especially in family. I had to stop for a moment after that, because suddenly I could hear his voice perfectly in my head. Calm, gentle, careful, the way he always sounded when trying to protect me without hurting me. There are documents. Walter will explain if necessary. I hope they never become necessary. But if anyone ever tries to make you feel weak, incapable, or unwanted in your own home, I need you to remember something. This house belongs to you as much as it ever belonged to me. And love given out of guilt is not love at all. Tears blurred the final lines briefly. Not dramatic tears. Just the quiet kind that arrive when someone who truly loved you still manages to protect you even after death. I folded the letter carefully against my chest. Then the phone rang. This time it wasn't Rebecca. It was Olivia. Grandma? Her voice sounded nervous. Are you busy? No, sweetheart. A pause. Then quietly, I think Mom's planning something for Sunday. My heartbeat slowed instantly. What do you mean? I overheard her talking to Dad tonight. Olivia lowered her voice further. She said if you agree to dinner, they might finally be able to get everything settled. Everything settled. The phrase made my skin crawl. Did she say anything else? Another pause. Then she mentioned paperwork. I closed my eyes slowly. Of course she did. Olivia sounded frightened now. I looked down at Richard's letter, still resting in my hands. For days, I had felt like prey. Old, cornered, manipulated quietly inside my own family. But something had changed tonight, because predators rely on one thing above all else: their target staying confused. And for the first time since my birthday party, I wasn't confused anymore. I was paying attention. Sunday arrived colder than expected. By late afternoon, thin gray clouds hung low over Lexington, and wind scattered brittle red leaves across Rebecca's driveway as I parked my car outside her house. For a moment, I considered leaving, just putting the car in reverse and driving home. At 7:30, your instincts sharpen in strange ways. Your body begins recognizing danger before your mind fully explains it. And sitting there gripping the steering wheel, I felt the same tightness in my stomach I used to feel before hospital visits or funerals. Something waited for me inside that house. I could feel it, but fear has a way of trapping older women into politeness. We spend decades avoiding scenes, avoiding conflict, avoiding becoming difficult. So I straightened my coat, picked up the apple pie I'd baked that morning out of pure habit, and walked to the front door. Rebecca opened it almost immediately. "Mom," she said brightly, leaning forward to kiss my cheek. "You look wonderful. Too warm, too rehearsed." Behind her, the house smelled like rosemary chicken and expensive candles. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers somewhere near the kitchen. Everything looked perfect. That alone made me suspicious now. Michael appeared from the dining room carrying wine glasses. "Good to see you, Margaret." His smile looked strained. Olivia hugged me tightly the second she entered the hallway. Longer than usual, a warning disguised as affection. Ethan barely glanced up from the sofa. "Hey, Grandma. Normal. Too normal." That's the thing about family betrayal. It rarely announces itself dramatically. Most of the time, it arrives wearing clean clothes and offering you dinner. Rebecca guided me toward the dining room with one hand lightly touching my elbow, as though I were fragile already. I noticed the folder immediately, dark blue, resting beside Rebecca's seat at the table. Legal size, my heartbeat slowed. Not sped up, slowed. Because suddenly, every piece finally connected perfectly. Walter's warning. Olivia's phone call. The paperwork trail. Rebecca smiled while pouring wine. "So," she said casually, "Michael and I have been talking a lot about ways to make life easier for everyone." There it was, the setup. I placed my napkin carefully across my lap. "Have you?" Michael cleared his throat, but stayed quiet. Rebecca continued smoothly. "You know we worry about you being alone in that big house." I noticed Olivia staring hard at her plate. Ethan kept scrolling his phone without interest. "We found a wonderful place in Wellesley," Rebecca continued. "Private gardens, security staff, transportation. It's honestly more like a resort than assisted living." Assisted living. There it was finally. No more gentle hints. No more coded language. She was saying it openly now. I cut a small piece of chicken slowly before answering. "I'm not moving." Rebecca laughed lightly for the children's benefit. "Oh, Mom, nobody's forcing anything." Then she touched the blue folder gently. "We just thought it might help to organize a few things early." Temporary planning paperwork. Temporary. Another dangerous word. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked calmly. Michael finally spoke. "Mostly precautionary documents." His voice sounded thin. Rebecca opened the folder and slid several pages across the table toward me. Power of attorney authorization. Property transition consultation. Medical decision support. I felt Olivia tense immediately beside me. Rebecca smiled patiently, the exact same way she used to smile at Ethan when he struggled with homework. "If something ever happened unexpectedly," she explained, "these forms would let us help manage things without legal complications. Help manage things. Not protect you. Not support you. Manage." I looked directly at Rebecca for several seconds, and suddenly I saw her clearly. Not as the little girl who once slept beside me during thunderstorms. Not as the teenager crying after heartbreak. Not even as my daughter. I saw a woman trying to secure assets before someone else could interfere. A real estate agent preparing a transfer. The realization hurt less than I expected. Because clarity eventually numbs pain. Rebecca slid a pen gently toward me. "You can read everything later," she said softly. "We just thought while everyone's together." "No." The word landed quietly. But the entire table froze. Rebecca blinked. "I'm sorry." I said no. Silence followed the room. Even Ethan looked up from his phone. For years, I had avoided confrontation with my daughter because I thought keeping peace meant preserving love. But peace without respect is just quiet control. Rebecca's expression tightened slightly. "Mom, you're overreacting." Another familiar word. I folded my hands neatly together. I had lunch with Walter Pierce on Friday. That got her attention immediately. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion crossed but Rebecca's face, fear small, quick, but unmistakable. Michael slowly lowered his wine glass. Olivia stared at me wide-eyed. Rebecca recovered quickly, of course. "Why would you meet with Walter?" she asked carefully. "Because someone needed to explain what you've been trying to do." The room went completely still. Outside, wind rattled against the dining room windows. Rebecca laughed once, sharp and defensive. "This is ridiculous." "Is it?" I reached calmly into my purse and removed Richard's letter. The same letter I had read 3 times the night before. Then I placed it gently beside my dinner plate. "You should know something, Rebecca," I said quietly. Her eyes locked onto mine. "Your father prepared for this possibility years ago." Now even Michael looked pale, and suddenly nobody at that table seemed hungry anymore.
Nobody touched their food after that.
The candles flickered softly in the center of Rebecca's dining table, while tension spread through the room like smoke. Even Ethan had finally put his phone down. Rebecca stared at Richard's letter beside my plate as though it might explode. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" she asked carefully. Her voice remained controlled, but I noticed something important for the first time. She sounded nervous. Not emotional, not hurt. Nervous people think about consequences. I folded my napkin calmly and placed it beside my untouched dinner. "Your father wasn't naive," I said quietly. "He understood that grief changes families. Sometimes not for the better." Rebecca crossed her arms immediately. "So now you're accusing me of something because I suggested assisted living?" "No," I replied. "I'm accusing you because you've spent months preparing people to believe I can no longer manage my own life." Michael looked down at the table instantly. That told me enough. He knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Rebecca let out a short laugh, meant to sound offended. "This is unbelievable." Olivia finally spoke for the first time all evening. "Mom?" Rebecca turned sharply toward her daughter. "What?" Olivia hesitated, then quietly. "You did tell Aunt Carol Grandma was getting confused lately." The room froze again. Rebecca blinked hard. "That's different." "No," Olivia whispered. "It isn't." I watched my granddaughter carefully then. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Poor girl. Children suffer most when they finally realize one parent is hurting another person on purpose. Rebecca's face hardened. "I was worried about her. You asked a realtor how fast her neighborhood sells." Olivia replied softly. Now Michael looked up sharply. "You talked to Greg?" Rebecca shot him an irritated look. "Oh, please, Michael, don't start." "Start." Interesting word again. As though this conversation had been happening privately for a long time already. I sat very still while years of confusion slowly rearranged themselves into understanding. That was the strange gift betrayal gives you eventually. Once the illusion breaks, old memories begin making sense all at once. The canceled holidays. The comments about aging. The pressure. They paperwork. It had never been random. Rebecca suddenly turned back toward me. Mom, honestly, this whole thing is insulting. After everything we've done for you, I almost smiled. There it was. The language of entitlement. People who manipulate others always keep score of their own kindness.
What exactly have you done for me?
I asked calmly. Silence. Rebecca looked stunned by the question itself, as though motherhood erased my right to ask it. Michael rubbed one hand across his forehead. Rebecca, he said quietly, maybe we should slow down. No, she snapped immediately. Because suddenly everyone's acting like I'm some kind of villain for trying to plan responsibly. Responsibly. Another carefully chosen word. I looked toward the hallway where framed family photographs covered the wall. Rebecca graduating college. Rebecca holding newborn Olivia in the hospital. Rebecca smiling beside Richard during one Christmas long ago. There were so many versions of her I still wanted to love. That was the hardest part. Not anger. Grief. Grieving someone still alive. You embarrassed me in front of an entire ballroom, I said quietly. Rebecca rolled her eyes instantly. Oh my God. Are we still talking about that? The cruelty of that response settled heavily over the room, because genuine remorse pauses when it sees pain. Rebecca only seemed irritated by it. Olivia looked horrified. Michael closed his eyes briefly. You told people I was invited out of pity, I continued calmly. It was a joke. No, I said softly. It was honesty. That finally shut her up. Outside, wind pressed rain against the dining room windows, while nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Ethan surprised everyone, including himself. That was kind of messed up, Mom. Rebecca stared at her son. You weren't even listening. I heard enough. Teenagers rarely speak during family conflict unless something truly crosses a line. Rebecca looked around the table slowly now, realizing the balance had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. Predators become defensive. The moment witnesses stop cooperating with the story. She stood abruptly and grabbed the blue folder from the table. Fine, she said sharply. Forget the paperwork. But she held the folder too tightly. That told me it mattered more than she wanted anyone to believe. Michael stood slowly. Rebecca, no. Her voice cracked slightly now. I'm tired of being treated like the bad guy, because I care what happens to this family. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said the one thing I think she never expected to hear from me. You care what happens to the house. Her face went pale instantly. Not furious, exposed. And in that moment, everyone at the table finally saw the same thing I had spent weeks slowly discovering. This was never about protecting me. It was about positioning herself before I became harder to control. Rebecca looked toward Michael desperately now. But he didn't defend her. That frightened her more than my words ever could. Because silence changes meaning once people stop standing beside you. I rose slowly from my chair and picked up my purse. Nobody's forcing you to leave, Rebecca said quickly. Interesting. I had never mentioned leaving. I looked directly into her eyes. You already did that, I said quietly. You just hoped I wouldn't notice until it was too late. Then I turned toward Olivia. Thank you for inviting me tonight, sweetheart. Olivia's eyes filled with tears immediately. And for the first time all evening, Rebecca looked genuinely afraid. Not of losing the house, of losing control of the story. I didn't sleep much after dinner at Rebecca's house. Not because of the argument, because something inside me had finally shifted beyond repair. For weeks, I had still been hoping this was all a misunderstanding. Stress, financial pressure, grief twisting people temporarily into colder versions of themselves. But once someone starts quietly pairing your removal from your own life, denial becomes impossible. By Monday morning, the rain had stopped. Pale sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains while I sat across from Walter Pierce once again. Richard's letter folded carefully inside my purse. Walter listened silently while I described the dinner, the folder, the paperwork. Rebecca's reaction when I mentioned the trust clause. When I finished, he removed his glasses slowly. "She knows now," he said. "Yes, and she's scared." I stared down at my coffee cup. "I don't understand how things became this ugly." Walter's expression softened slightly. "Maggie, inheritance changes people long before money actually appears." That sentence stayed with me, because Rebecca hadn't suddenly become selfish at 46 years old. The signs had probably existed for years. I simply kept translating them into excuses, because mothers are trained to interpret cruelty gently when it comes from their children. Walter opened a legal folder and slid several documents toward me. "I reviewed everything you brought last week." My stomach tightened instantly. There were attempted changes. I looked up sharply. "What kind of changes?" "Nothing completed successfully." He paused carefully. "But Rebecca had already begun requesting preliminary incapacity evaluations through your insurance network." The room suddenly felt cold. She was trying to declare me incompetent? Walter chose his words cautiously. She was building documentation that could support future guardianship discussions. Guardianship. The word made my skin crawl, not because strangers wanted control, because my daughter did. I leaned back slowly in the chair, while memories replayed themselves differently now. Rebecca insisting on attending doctor appointments, correcting me in conversations unnecessarily, laughing whenever I forgot small details. Tiny performances repeated often enough to create doubt around me. Not concern, preparation. Walter folded his hands together. "The good news is she moved too early." "What does that mean?" "You're mentally sound, financially independent. Your records show no cognitive decline." His expression sharpened slightly. "And frankly, her paper trail looks opportunistic." For the first time in days, I exhaled fully. Not relief exactly. More like stabilization, Walter continued. "I recommend immediate changes. Within an hour, we updated every major legal document connected to my estate. New medical directives, new financial protections, revoked access permissions." Rebecca's name disappeared from every emergency authorization connected to property or banking. I expected to feel guilty while signing the paperwork. Instead, I felt calm. That surprised me most. Maybe because deep down, I already understood something painful. Trust without safety isn't love. It's surrender. Walter handed me the final packet, neatly clipped together. "There's one more matter," he said carefully. I looked up. "Your original estate plan left the house equally divided between Rebecca and the grandchildren." "Yes." Walter paused. "You can change that." Silence settled softly across the office. Outside the window, people moved through Lexington Center, carrying coffee cups and shopping spoons beneath bright autumn trees. Ordinary lives. Ordinary Mondays. Meanwhile, mine had quietly become a legal defense against my own child. I stared at Richard's signature on one of the older trust documents. For 40 years, that house had been our life together. Every birthday, every Christmas morning, every argument and reconciliation, an ordinary Tuesday night dinner. Rebecca only saw market value. Olivia still saw home. "I want the house protected," I said quietly. Walter nodded once, as though he had expected that answer. By the time I left his office, the air outside felt colder than before. Wind moved sharply through the streets, while dry leaves scraped across the sidewalk around my shoes. My phone buzzed before I even reached the car. Rebecca. I let it ring twice before answering. Her voice sounded strangely soft. "Mom, can we talk?" Interesting. Not, "You embarrassed me." Not, "You overreacted." Can we talk? People change their tone quickly once they realize control is slipping. "I'm busy," I replied calmly. A pause. Then, Olivia says you think I'm trying to steal the house. I unlocked my car slowly. Aren't you? Silence. Longer this time. Finally, Rebecca sighed heavily. You're twisting everything. No, I said quietly. I'm finally seeing it clearly. Her breathing sharpened slightly on the other end. You know what your problem is? She snapped suddenly. You always make yourself the victim. The cruelty in her voice no longer shocked me. That stage had passed. Now I simply heard desperation beneath it. Because Rebecca understood something important now. Walter Pierce was involved. The paperwork had failed, and I was no longer confused enough to sign whatever she placed in front of me. You taught me something recently, I said calmly. What? That people can smile at you while planning your removal. Silence again. Then quietly, dangerously. So what now? I looked out across the parking lot while cold wind bent the maple trees overhead. For days, Rebecca had treated me like a frightened old woman, clinging emotionally to a house. She still didn't understand. This was never only about property. It was about dignity. And once older women stop prioritizing peace over self-respect, people who depend on their silence become very afraid. I think, I said softly, now we let the lawyers speak. 3 days later, Rebecca received the formal legal notice. Walter mailed it directly to her office. I know because Michael called me less than an hour after it arrived. Margaret, he said, the moment I answered, his voice tight with panic. What did you do? I stood in my kitchen, watering the small basil plant near the window, while sunlight spilled softly across the countertops. The normalness of the moment almost felt surreal. What do you mean? I asked calmly. You removed Rebecca from everything. Everything. Interesting word. As though access to my finances, medical decisions, and property had somehow belonged to her naturally. I set the watering can down slowly. No, I replied quietly. I removed her from things she should never have controlled in the first place. Silence. Then Michael sighed heavily. She's falling apart right now. For years, that sentence would have destroyed me. A mother's weakness is simple. Even after being hurt, part of her still wants to comfort the child holding the knife. But something had changed inside me recently. Not my love for Rebecca. My willingness to sacrifice myself for it. She should talk to her lawyer, I said. Margaret? No, Michael. My voice stayed calm. You knew what was happening. That stopped him cold. Outside, wind stirred fallen leaves across the backyard patio Richard built years ago. I watched them scrape soft across the stone while Michael struggled to answer. Finally, he whispered, I didn't think it would go this far. With quiet betrayals, people convince themselves they're only standing nearby while someone else crosses the line. But silence participates eventually. I loved your family, I said softly. I trusted you. His breathing sounded uneven now. I know, and strangely enough, I believed him. Michael wasn't cruel the way Rebecca had become cruel. Weakness and cruelty are different things, though they often work together beautifully. After we hung up, I carried my coffee into the living room and sat beside the window. For the first time in weeks, the house felt peaceful again. Not safe exactly. But mine. There's power in reclaiming ownership over your own life, even quietly. Especially quietly. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I already knew who it was before opening the door. Olivia stood on the porch holding a paper bag from the bakery downtown. Her eyes looked exhausted. Hi, Grandma. I pulled her into a hug immediately. The poor girl trembled the moment I touched her. Inside the kitchen, she set the pastries down carefully before speaking. Mom's furious. I nodded once, I assumed. Olivia sat across from me at the table, while sunlight warmed the hardwood floors around us. For a moment, she looked very young again. Not a law student. Not a woman caught between loyalty and truth. Just Rebecca's little girl. She says you embarrassed her, Olivia said quietly. I almost smiled. Did I? Olivia looked down at her hands. She keeps saying you turned everyone against her. That hurt more than I expected, because Rebecca still believed reputation mattered more than behavior itself. She turned people against herself, I replied softly. Silence settled gently between us. Then Olivia whispered something that made my chest ache. I don't recognize her anymore. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Yes, I said quietly. You do. She looked up sharply. Because that's the painful truth. Children eventually learn about their parents. Character rarely appears suddenly. It reveals itself slowly under pressure. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. She was already talking to another realtor last month, she admitted. I heard her say your house could probably sell in under 2 weeks. There it was again. Not grief, not concern, strategy. I looked around the kitchen slowly while memories drifted quietly through me. Rebecca at 8 years old baking Christmas cookies beside me. Rebecca asleep on Richard's shoulder during long car rides. Rebecca crying after her first heartbreak, while I sat awake all night comforting her. How does love become entitlement? Maybe slowly. Maybe invisibly. Maybe through years of never hearing the word no. I keep thinking this is my fault somehow, Olivia whispered. It isn't, but you always gave Mom everything. I smiled sadly at that. Yes, I admitted. And sometimes that's a mistake. Because love without boundaries doesn't always create gratitude. Sometimes it creates expectation. The doorbell rang again before either of us could continue. This time, Dorothy stood outside, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. I brought lasagna, she announced immediately. Because emotional collapse requires carbohydrates. Despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh. The first one in weeks. Dorothy stepped inside and looked between Olivia and me carefully. Well, she said dryly, judging from Rebecca's Facebook post this morning, I'd say Lexington officially has a scandal. My stomach tightened instantly. What post? Dorothy pulled out her phone. Rebecca had uploaded a photograph from my birthday party. In the picture, she stood beside me, smiling beautifully beneath the ballroom lights. The caption read, "Trying so hard to care for aging parents is never easy. Some people don't appreciate the sacrifices family makes for them." I stared at the screen quietly. Even now, even after everything, she was still trying to control the story. Dorothy watched my face carefully. Then she said something I would remember for the rest of my life. Maggie, people who manipulate others survive by making their victims look unstable. I looked back at the photograph, Rebecca smiling warmly beside me while quietly planning my removal from the life I built. And suddenly, for the first time since my 70th birthday, I no longer felt heartbroken. I felt finished. Rebecca stopped posting about me after Walter responded publicly. Not directly. Walter was too professional for that. But after Rebecca uploaded her carefully worded Facebook post about the difficulty of caring for aging parents, he sent a formal notice telling her that publicly implying mental instability, while attempting to obtain legal authority over someone's finances, could become very problematic in court. The post disappeared within an hour. Funny how quickly performances end once consequences arrive. After that, things became quiet. Not peaceful. Just quiet in the exhausted way. Storms become quiet after destroying enough. Rebecca stopped calling daily. The cheerful text messages vanished. No more articles about senior communities. No more fake concern, wrapped in polite language. For the first time in years, silence between us finally sounded honest. October slowly turned into November. The maple trees outside my kitchen window, Ulysses one by one until only bare branches remained against the gray Massachusetts sky. Every morning I sat with coffee beside the window. Richard loved and watched frost gather softly across the backyard patio. Life became smaller, but strangely, it also became lighter. Walter finalized the updated estate documents before Thanksgiving. The house would remain protected in a trust exactly as Richard intended. Olivia would eventually inherit it, along with instructions that the property could never be sold while I was alive, unless I personally requested it. When Walter explained everything, I felt something unexpected, not victory, relief. Because contrary to what people think, older women like me do not spend our final years wanting revenge. We want safety. We want dignity. We want to stop feeling like burdens in rooms we once built with our own hands. Olivia started visiting every Sunday afterward. Sometimes we baked cinnamon bread together. Sometimes she studied law textbooks at my dining room table while I watered plants or folded laundry nearby. Ordinary things, healing things. One afternoon in early December, she looked up from her notebook and asked quietly, "Do you think Mom loves you?" The question hung heavily between us. Outside, snow drifted softly across the yard. I took longer answering than she probably expected. "Yes," I said finally. Olivia frowned slightly. After everything, I folded a dish towel slowly in my lap. "Love and entitlement can exist inside the same person," I said quietly. "That's what makes family heartbreak so confusing. Because Rebecca did love me once. Maybe part of her still did. But somewhere along the way, she started loving comfort more than gratitude, control more than closeness. And once people begin seeing family members as obstacles to money, property, or convenience, love changes shape into something colder." Christmas arrived quietly that year. No grand family dinner. No crowded dining room. Just me, Olivia, Dorothy, and Michael. Yes, Michael came too. That surprised everyone, including himself. He stood awkwardly in my doorway, holding a pecan pie from the grocery store and looking like a man carrying years of guilt on his shoulders. "I understand if you don't want me here," he said softly. I looked at him for a long moment before stepping aside. People who stay silent during cruelty still have to live with themselves afterward, I told him quietly. His eyes filled immediately. Sometimes consequences are heavier than punishment. Dinner that night felt small compared to the enormous holiday gatherings Richard and I used to host, but it felt real. No performances, no manipulation, no one quietly calculating what my death might provide them financially. Just warmth. Halfway through dessert, Olivia laughed so hard at one of Dorothy's terrible jokes that coffee nearly came out of her nose. The sound filled the dining room beautifully. And suddenly, I realized something important. Family is not the people who claim ownership over your life. Family is the people who protect your dignity when you no longer have the strength to fight alone. Late that evening, after everyone left, I stood alone in the hallway beside the grandfather clock. Richard bought decades ago. The house was quiet again, but no longer lonely. I touched the framed photograph hanging beside the staircase. Richard smiling beside me during our last trip to Cape Cod. Wind in my hair, his hand wrapped tightly around mine. For a moment, grief moved through me gently. Not sharp anymore, just deep. "I handled it," I whispered softly. And somehow, standing there in the house we built together, I think part of him already knew I would. My phone buzzed quietly in my sweater pocket. A text message from Rebecca. "Merry Christmas, Mom." Nothing else. No apology. No explanation. Just those 3 words sitting alone on the screen between us. I stared at them for a long time. Then I typed carefully, "Merry Christmas, Rebecca," because forgiveness and access are not the same thing. That was the final lesson my daughter taught me at 70 years old. Some people invite you into their lives out of love. Others invite you out of guilt, obligation, or appearance. But dignity begins the moment you stop begging to remain where you are no longer respected. And that winter, for the first time in many years, I finally stopped begging. At 70 years old, I learned that loneliness is painful. But being tolerated instead of loved is far worse. I spent years mistaking silence for peace and guilt for family loyalty, until my own daughter taught me how easily kindness can be mistaken for weakness. But growing older does not make a woman powerless. Sometimes it simply teaches her to stop protecting people who no longer protect her heart. And in the end, I realize dignity is not staying where you are merely tolerated. It is having the courage to quietly walk away and still keep your head held high.